So this is update machine.py, and I'll just walk you through the program. So what it is doing, I'm defining a global connection variable. The connection variable is connecting to the database as usual. There would be only one connection per API. And here I'm implementing the update machine API using the function update underscore machine, and it would accept only put HTTP method. All right. So after that, what am I getting here is that the input is workstation ID. So I'm getting the workstation ID using this request.args.get variable, and then I'm creating an output data which is an empty dictionary. And as you can imagine that the output data would contain rather the output that is being sent from this API. This is the get machine SQL statement. What is happening here is that I'm selecting the machine ID from the machine table where the machine is available, and I'm executing it using a cursor by passing the SQL statement, and then I'm fetching only one row. Now this portion of the code is a little new because I have not shown you this at all. Now if you see, it's a little special because I have not put any condition in the if logic, or in the if statement. What am I doing here is that if the machine ID is null, in case of Python, null is denoted as no, any or none, then machine ID would be false. If there is a value in this machine ID, then it will be true, then the object or the variable would be true. So what am I trying to do here is that if there is an output row from the table, then process this particular logic. If not, then put the machine ID as error in the output data, meaning that there are no machines in this machine table which are available. All right. Okay. So that's what it is. After fetching from the cursor, I'm putting the output in this machine ID variable or object, whatever you might want to call it. What I'm checking is that whether there is a value or not. And if I just mention the variable name with the if logic, what this expression is trying to do, it would output true if machine ID contains value. If the machine ID contains no, any, which is actually none in Python, then it would go to the else statement. Okay, so only if we have some value in the machine ID variable, then I am fetching the actual record. Now what would happen is, why have I put this? Because if I do not put this and there are no machines, then this execution wherein I'm trying to get the first element of the array, because there is only one element by the way, it will error out if machine ID is null. So the program would fail. Okay, so I'm getting the machine ID, I'm closing the cursor. We'll have to close the cursor because I'm will be opening it again. And this time, what am I doing? I'm updating the machine ID which I have retrieved. So this is the statement update machine ID, set is available equal to no, and the workstation ID would be equal to the value of the workstation that I'm getting from the API call, where the machine ID equal to the value, which is this one, which I've got from this SQL statement. And once this is done, the cursor would be executed. Then I'm closing the cursor, and then only I'm sending the machine ID, which is this part of the program. So we'll be sending WSID or workstation ID to our update machine API, and it'll try to get the machine ID from the machine table, whichever machine is available. And if we get a machine ID, then we'll update the machine ID to be not available, is available should be equal to n, and we'll also update the workstation ID with this particular workstation that we have sent to this API. And where have we sent it from? We have sent it from create assembly line. I'll talk about create assembly line shortly. Let's go to the next API, which is update worker. And what it should do, it should again get workstation ID as an input, and it will get worker from the worker table and update the worker table, which is this program, that is update worker. And I have the same connect to database function. I am running the Flask application in port number 12,000. I'm connecting to the database, and the connection object would be in CONN variable, which is a global variable. Just for your information, update machine would be running on port number 13,000. As you already know that you cannot run on the same port if you are using a single machine. In my case, I'll be using my local machine to connect to Aurora. Obviously, you should not do that. If you want, you can, but better to implement them using EC2 instances. So you'll get a sense of how AWS works, so that when I talk about ECS, it will be a little easier for you to implement using ECS. So the URL endpoint is update worker, and it would allow only post method. I'm getting this assigned WS ID. So actually I'm passing assigned WS ID as the argument name, and I'm getting the value using request.args.get, and I'm storing it in assigned WS ID, and I'm initializing an empty dictionary which is output data. I'm opening a cursor. Now I'm selecting worker ID from worker with the condition is available equal to yes, which has to be there. But at the same time, I'm also trying to find a worker who is assigned for a particular workstation ID. The reason is that there are categories of workers in a particular manufacturing plant. For example, the person who is involved in paint job, that person cannot do machine assembly. Or the person who is involved in putting the interior in place, he or she cannot work on paint job, etc. That's why you have different workstations as per the category of jobs, and we have particular worker ID assigned to those workstations. So this is the business statement, right? So I'm selecting the worker ID for that particular workstation. I'm executing the cursor and I'm fetching only one record. Just like the previous program, I am checking whether worker ID is null or not null. So this translates to if worker ID is not null, then do something. And if it is null, then do this piece of code or execute this piece of code. Actually, it should be the other way around. My bad. Okay, so now it makes sense. So if it is not null, if we have retrieved an worker ID, then close the previous cursor, select the worker ID, and in the output data, I'm passing the worker ID. Then I'm opening the cursor again and I'm updating the worker table just to make the worker unavailable. So I'm passing the worker ID which I have just fetched. And then I'm executing the SQL statement and closing the cursor and committing the connection. If worker ID is null, which means we have not retrieved any value, so in that case I'll mention worker ID equal to error. As simple as that. It's short, but integrating them together might be a little complicated. Then finally I have workstation, and here again the connection to the database and global connection object. I'm running it in port number 11,000. Let's look at the code. So I'm using this get WS, and as I have already told you, I'm passing a bay ID, so which I'm retrieving using the request.args variable. Output record is the output data. I'm opening a cursor and I'm selecting the workstation ID and the next workstation ID from workstation table, where bay ID equal to certain value and is available flag is Y. So I'm getting the workstation ID and the next workstation ID. So once the work completes here, it will be passed on to the next workstation ID. That's why I'm getting these two values from the workstation table, but for a particular bay ID. So if you remember, I talked about the bay ID. I'm executing it, and again I'm using cursor.fetch1. If record is not null, that means there's some value in this variable, which means that this SQL statement did return some value, otherwise it would return an empty set. Okay, so if there is some value available, then assign the workstation ID and the next workstation ID, and I'm using this parm variable wherein the name of the argument is assigned WSID and the value is in the assigned WSID variable, which is this one, which I'm getting from this SQL statement. And then I'm calling using post method and the requests module. I have already imported requests module. So I'm using the post method. Why post method? Because if you go to update worker, it allows only post method. So instead of requests.request, I am using requests.post. This is the URL endpoint for update worker, and I'm passing the arguments using params keyword, and the argument is parm variable, which is assigned WSID. Now let's go to the update worker API. It would actually get an assigned WSID, and it would store the value of assigned WSID in the local variable assigned WSID. This is the parameter which was passed, and this is a local variable for this function. And then this assigned WSID would be used in the SQL statements and in other places. Okay, so now I am checking the status code. So if the status code is equal to 200, then do certain things. Where am I getting this status code from? As you can see, I am using the requests module and the post method. So the response would be stored here. In the requests library video, I had told you that there are multiple variables and functions that we get. One of them is status code. And the status code can be 200 even if the result set is empty, because the SQL execution was successful, right? It did not find any record, that's a different story, but the SQL execution was correct. So I am getting the worker ID and I'm using the JSON method. So what is this JSON method? Using this JSON method, we get the output, which is actually the worker ID. And then I'm updating the workstation and making it not available, closing the cursor, and in the output record, I'm mentioning worker ID, next workstation ID, and workstation ID. Where am I getting this worker ID from? I'm getting this worker ID from this API call, and it would be in the worker ID variable. Why worker ID variable? Because in the update worker, I'm returning the output data and I'm storing the value of worker ID, or I'm sending the worker ID value in the worker ID variable. So that's why I'm capturing the worker ID variable in update workstation and using that for further processing. So this would be the case if the worker was found. If the worker was not found, then it will give error saying that message worker is not found. So no worker found, please try a different workstation. The workstation ID would contain error, worker ID would contain error, next workstation ID would also contain error. Now this is for HTTP status code 200. The first one would be if we get records, and the second portion is if we don't get record. So that's why I have used try and catch. Now here, if the status code is not 200, then again worker not found, no worker found, try a different workstation. I'm actually sending the same error code. Okay, so this is from the API call of update worker. So based on update worker, I am using this execution. Now let's go back to the if logic. Now here, what am I saying? If there is an output, if I get an workstation, then do these processings. If not, then obviously error it out. So this is the workstation. So now let's go back to the diagram. So we've implemented this, and we have implemented update workstation and update worker also. So in update worker, we are using WSID, and I'm getting the worker ID from worker table, whichever worker is available. And once I get the worker, I'm marking the worker as not available. And then I'm passing the worker ID to workstation, and then I'm updating the workstation to be not available. So in this particular program, as you can see, I'm only updating the workstation table when I get a worker ID. If I don't get worker ID, which is this one and this one, there is no update statement. That means I'm keeping the workstation as available. So this is a synchronous call. The update would happen only if I get the worker ID. If I don't get worker ID, I would throw an error message saying that the worker is not available. So all these nested APIs are done. Now let's look at create assembly line. So this is the final API. And here first I'm calling this get workstation, which is this one. So when I call it using the get method, requests.get, I'm passing ws bay id, which will actually be the bay id. And I'm passing it using the parm variable and the params keyword. So this get ws API would be called, which is the update workstation API. And it would get a workstation based on the bay ID, make these API calls to update worker and get the worker ID, update the workstation, and then return back here. If I get workstation IDs, then I'll get the record, and if I don't get a record, then I'll error out saying that workstation not found. And for non 200 code, again I'm printing the same output. Alright, so there are some print statements here, and if WSID is equal to error, then I'm sending a message that which I'm getting from the previous API call, get WS API, and then I'm making a call to the update machine API. Alright, so let's proceed. And if the machine is found, then only I'm inserting in assembly line table, and then using these values I'm inserting into the production log. And if nothing is fine, then I'm giving this error that no machine found for workstation, try another bay. So we have implemented all of it. Now let's go ahead and try these APIs. What will I do? I'll call this API create assembly line with a bay ID, which is, let's say, not there in the table, and then I'll pass a bay ID which is there in the table. And there can be errors. My code is not error free. There can be errors. So if you execute my code and if you find errors, please go ahead and fix those. That is also part of your exercise. Now let's start all the programs. First I'll start update machine, then I'll start update worker, then update workstation, and finally create assembly line. I have implemented using the opposite direction, meaning that I have implemented these things first, or these APIs first, and then I did the coding for create assembly line API. If you want to do it the other way around, that is perfectly fine. You might be comfortable with creating the main API first and then the other APIs. That is also perfectly fine. There's no hard and fast rule that the lowest level of APIs have to be created first. That's what I did, but you can start from create assembly line API also.